like to just welcome everyone out to the CTAC meeting this afternoon. Thank you all for taking time out of your lunch to come spend time with us and go over the CTAC scoring for this year's round of COG applications. We first, I guess, is there anyone here that doesn't know anyone else? Do we need to do a quick round of introductions, or for the most part? Okay,
Why don't we do it just to put it on the recording?
No,
okay. I'll start and go around, and then we'll finish with those on the screen. So Jesse Mott, Cache County, and staff to the COG.
Jeff Gilbert with the CMPO, staff of the call.
Craig Rasmussen, Forestman Associates, working in several communities in the valley.
Tom Dickinson, Yogi City.
Weston Belong with JUB in Richmond City.
Lance Anderson, I'm Cash on Mike from Logan City.
Marcus Alton, Hyde Park City.
Alan Luce, North Logan City.
Jordan Nolan, North City. Blake Bodley, Smithfield City.
Max Pierce, CRS in Cornerstown.
43 Myrtle City.
Ryan Snow, Providence City. And Matt, you want to introduce yourself online?
Yeah, Matt Holmes from Hiram City.
Dallas?
I'm Dallas Wall. I'm with WCG, and I provided the safety analysis of the application.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so we'll just, again, there's only really two agenda items for today's meeting, so kind of to review and approve the 2023 COG project CTAC scoring recommendation that will go to all the mayors for prior to the presentations that will occur on Monday, and then also just an update and allow people to see the comment log that is printed out. That was the technical questions that were raised, the response from the applicants, and there's some notes from COG staff as well. So we'll turn the time over to Jeff to let him do this congestion mitigation, and then we'll go to Dallas for the safety analysis review.
So this was handed out is a summary of the, as you recall, the technical committee's tasked with overseeing and providing a scoring recommendation to the full COG on three categories. One is the congestion relief category, advanced right-of-way preservation, and safety. And so unless we have changes here today, this is what's proposed to move forward to the, that will be used by the elected officials. So this represents about 40% of the weight, overall weight, in terms of scoring for the final score. And then residing with the, collectively with the mayors, is the other 60% of the weight based on their rankings. So I will, ultimately, we will be looking for a motion to approve this recommendation. The documentation to support that, I'll tell you that we didn't have any projects that kind of met the specific criteria for gaining points for advanced corridor preservation. And those projects have to be that you're seeking funding to buy right of way for a corridor that you're not in construction mode for at least 10 years out. It's trying to incentivize kind of forward thinking on corridors that are out there a ways. And so we don't have any projects that really fit that category. All the projects we have, even if they have right of way elements, they are in the relative, they're relatively soon when they intend to construct those. On the congestion, I apologize, it's kind of small, but on the back page of this, you'll see the data and the inputs. Our criteria for that, and I'll show you it. The criteria that CTAC uses in our approved manual. On this. I was just going to show this. So this is kind of what we do, which is we have, in terms of congestion, we have a measure of either existing roadway volumes or future roadway volumes. And then that is compared to sort of a capacity ratio. So the highway capacity manual helps us to determine these. And if you have a volume to capacity ratio, either existing or in the future, that's anticipated to be high, has to approach, what is it, 0.57 or above to gain points. Other than there's kind of a default 1 point. So if your project is more congested, you can get up to 3 points to begin with in our criteria. And then depending on what your project does to improve it, the solution, there's a modifier that gets added to that. So for instance, if you're just doing no capacity maintenance shouldering type project, the 1 point you got in the first phase gets taken away. If you're doing a project that has some moderate improvements to capacity, a certain center turn lane, realignment, intersection project, then it's sort of, the modifier is 0, so you keep that 1 point that you got. And if you're doing things like adding lanes or a entirely new road or new road segment, you get a +1. And then that's weighted at 5 for possible 15. So what you see in here is kind of how your project shook out for that. So we talked about this and presented this at the last meeting. Subsequent to that, I had some input from some of you, and we made some minor changes on some of them. Some of them we just didn't know enough about the project, and so based on clarifications, we were able to make some of those changes. And this is where we find ourselves on that. So are there any issues or concerns, questions on that we should bring up on the congestion? I want to work quite quickly. If you want, afterwards, I can sit down with your project and kind of talk your project through it individually. Here in silence. We're good. Okay, so the next category is safety. And those of you that have been around for a while, in the history on this, we struggled in the past to figure out a way to really capture safety. Our process some years ago for that was to use a benefit cost analysis to sort of say, okay, how much is the project costing and what is the safety benefit in terms of reduction in crashes that you're anticipating to get. That's a really good way to evaluate safety projects. The problem for us though is our projects typically aren't pure safety projects. They're a project like a corridor improvement, a widening, or that is really motivated by some other motive other than just safety. Now, they may have a safety component to it, and some have more safety components than others, but nonetheless, it's not a pure safety project. So pure safety projects work well to run through a cost benefit analysis, because then you're really looking at, all right, what are we doing to improve the safety? How much is it costing? So we have sort of abandoned that way of doing things, and we shifted to hiring a really smart dude. That really smart dude is Dallas Wall. And if you turn on his camera, you can see how smart he looks. But
So
Dallas,
you'll make fun of my Cubs hoodie now that you've introduced me as an intelligent person.
well, you're a persistent, long-suffering person. So, we shifted a mode to, so Dallas is kind of the safety guru in the state. His company is tasked by UDOT to turn the crank on their safety project analysis scoring process. So he's got a lot of experience of trying to evaluate projects. These COG projects are a little different, in the sense, like I explained, they're not a pure safety project, which is a little different than what Dallas normally does. So he has to kind of figure out, all right, what are the safety elements? What are the ones that can be evaluated? But essentially what we've done is we've decided to have a third-party safety analysis conducted on the projects. And we've kind of given Dallas the framework of our scoring, which is he basically has 15 points that he can assign based on his professional judgment, based on his analysis that he does. Because these projects are so different, you know, it's hard to lock in a particular safety data analysis way to get to it. But, you know, so there's some professional engineering judgment that we've given Dallas the ability to exercise. Dallas has no dog in the fight or project. He's not beholden to any bias, we try to take a light hand as staff of just letting him exercise his judgment on making sure he has the information he needs to do it, but largely turn that judgment over to him, and then he can kind of assign points. And so with that, I'm going to turn time over to Dallas, but I'll note in this packet, the printout, you will see kind of his memo to Jesse. On this page is where you really cut to the chase. You see the scores that he's assigned. So now's your opportunity to kind of ask questions of that. And Dallas, do you want to just kind of go over it and review your scoring approach?
Sure. Yeah, if you guys, I hope everyone has a copy of the memo I sent Jesse. It's pretty straightforward. There's just a few things I want to point out in general at the beginning of this. When we sat down and we tried to, you know, figure out how is the best way to assign points, we decided what we were going to do is we were going to assess every application, every group of applications for that year as independent of any other year. So what that means is it's kind of like a foot race. Whoever shows that they can reduce the most amount of crashes through their efforts in their project, they are awarded 15 points. Then what I do is I prorate all the other applications based on the number of crashes that's predicted they're going to reduce every year. And I always round up so that everyone gets, you know, a point rather than fractions of points. And then, you know, basically the projects that I can't really justify having a safety improvement on, those get 0 points. And those are just basically maintenance improvements or pavement preservation projects that their purpose is to maintain the asset that you currently have in your towns and cities. So that's kind of the theory behind the scoring. Now, everything boils down to the number of crashes that are going to change per year, that predicted number of crashes that's going to change per year, based on the processes outlined in the Highway Safety Manual. So, excuse me. You'll notice the numbers are quite low, which means basically at some of these low end things, you know, we're well within the cloud of the error on these estimates. But again, remember what we're trying to do is just give a reasonable measure of the magnitude of change in safety and whether it can be measured or not. So the primary function of crashes is the amount of vehicles that are on your roadway. And that's why every year Jesse calls each of you and talks to you about what your estimated number of vehicles or your average daily travel is for each of these roadways. And I use that in the models to predict what kind of crashes and how crashes are going to change with the changes in the roadway. One thing I did this year that was different than last year, I noticed that many of the applications had an effort to provide safer roadways for pedestrians and bicyclists. And so I thought I would add, I think it's on the second page or the third page there after table 1, I added this little analysis for you guys to consider and think about. What I did was I took the number of crashes that occurred in Cache County from 2018 to 2022, and I assigned them a crash cost based on the 2023 crash cost published by UDOT. We update that every year with the FHWA, and it's used in our analysis method. And then what I did is I separated them out into vehicle crashes and pedestrian or bicycle crashes. And what I was trying to get down to is what the average cost per crash is. And that kind of shows the different severity distribution on these pedestrians and bicycle crashes. Of course, they're often referred to as vulnerable road users because when they get hit by a vehicle, that transfer of mass is pretty lopsided. And so you end up having, greater severity for pedestrians and bicycles, which is kind of a known without saying. But what I tried to do here is quantify how much more dangerous they are. And if we look at the crash costs, the way I've done it, the average crash costs are for pedestrians and bicyclists are 6.8 times more severe than vehicle crashes. And so in an effort to try to help those applicants that had gone out of their way to provide facilities for pedestrians and bicyclists, I just gave an additional point if they included, sidewalks or separated sidewalks or bicycle lanes or buffered bicycle lanes. Anything that gave a better opportunity for the pedestrians and bicyclists, I just randomly gave a point to them. And you'll notice up in table 1 in my notes, I will have listed, this included VRU improvements. And that was because when I looked at your plans, I said, okay, now they've done something different for the pedestrians and bicyclists that is better than what typically happens on a roadway project. And so just keep that in mind. I did assign additional points when those improvements were applied. Now, I think the thing you'll be most interested in is in Appendix A, and that's just basically we started out with my analysis notes. So just so you understand kind of what happens, Jesse gives me a copy of all of your applications, and I go through your plans, I go through your application descriptions, and I start making notes about what's happening at that project. And then what I do is I go through and I'll do a subsection called analysis notes. So I'll separate out the applications by saying, these ones I'm going to analyze, and these ones, there's no point in spending money to analyze them. And the ones that I analyze, I add what's called analysis points. And these are just things to keep in mind that are helping me understand and remember when I do the inputs into the model, what's changing and what needs to be updated, so that I can calculate those changes in predicted crashes. There's a link called location on there. It's a hyperlink. If you've got a paper copy, it won't work, but an electronic copy, that hyperlink will jump to a place in Google Maps that'll show that location so that you can see it kind of the way I'm looking at it. Okay, so keep in mind, I'm subject to, whatever the latest aerial photography is on Google Maps. And then I compare that with your plan. I relocate that. I'll take measurements off of your plan. I'll take measurements off of the existing condition in order to calculate the changes in crashes that are being predicted. And then I just have a snippet from your plans to help remind me, what I'm analyzing and what I'm looking at. I brought this one up for Hyde Park. I think is interesting because in the past, I don't like to consider new roadways. And the reason I don't like to consider them is because it becomes difficult in the analysis. There becomes this discussion about, okay, what are the crashes now versus what the crashes are going to be in the future. Okay. And since there's no road there and there's no users there, then the current condition is 0. And so when you build something new, your crash exposure is going to increase, and therefore it would get a negative score. And that doesn't seem to make sense. So by and large, for the most part, I don't consider new roadway segments in the analysis. Now, that being said, this project up in Hyde Park is an existing roadway to, I think, what they call the Butkus residence. That's kind of right in the middle of that picture there. That roadway to the right is all existing roadway, and the roadway to the left is all open field. So the safety analysis that I'm calculating the change in crashes on is only based on the existing roadway segment. Okay, and that goes the same for the new intersection that they're going to put in there on the left-hand side at 160 when they connect. I think it's 160 north when they connect back into the existing roadway segment. I don't consider that intersection in part of the analysis because that's going to become a new intersection, and intersections inherently increase crashes. And so I don't want to penalize them for adding a new intersection when one doesn't already exist. Now, if one already exists and we're going to upgrade it somehow, then I'll do an analysis on it. Okay, so that's kind of the process and procedure that I did for each of your applications. As you go through Appendix A, you might want to go through and find your city and read those segments and see if there's anything there that raises a flag or gives you a concern about kind of what I've written there. There were some inherently odd projects that I had some difficulty with. One of them, if you could go to Mendon, I'd like to talk about Mendon for a second. The Mendon analysis, these are all existing roadways in Mendon, and they're widening the roadway, and then they're reconfiguring that intersection there on the right. Now, inherently, that intersection is kind of difficult to analyze because the existing condition is this short horizontal curve into a stop-controlled T intersection. Now, I can model a T intersection. What I can't model in this type of environment is that sharp horizontal curve into the intersection. Furthermore, the new configuration, this Y configuration, is not really an intersection type that's been recognized in the Highway Safety Manual, so they haven't modeled it and they haven't given me parameters to model it. So when I look at a segment like this, if I get some oddball, I shouldn't say oddball, if I get a configuration that I can't really fit into a separate bucket, then I'll ignore that portion. I'll make an educated guess as to whether I feel that new condition is safer than the old condition, which I think most of us will agree. I think the new intersection is safer than the old intersection. And so I'll base my change in crashes on the widening segment only. Mendon was one like that. I don't know if there's any questions from the guys from Mendon there. The next one, Millville, was a bit of a puzzle. So if you go to the next page on Millville, really what's going on Millville here is where we have two T intersections right on a curve. And at first I thought, okay, what if I modeled this as two stop-controlled intersections, and then I compared it with one always stop three-way intersection. Now, the always stop models were just published last year, and so this was kind of my, breaking out of let's try to model some of these these always stop intersections. When I went ahead and did that, and I modeled it that way, there were the predictive model said there would be slightly more crashes at the new configuration than the old configuration. And I decided here that, well, that's not reasonable. And I think everyone in the room will agree that the new configuration is safer than the old configuration. And so I did not provide an analysis, or I did the analysis, but I didn't base the scoring on this analysis. Instead, I made a comment where I'm like, I'm going to give them the same number of points that I gave Trenton, which is down below. And that was based purely on the fact that they were the two applications that had about the closest number of vehicles. They weren't the same, but they were closest. And so I said, well, I'm going to give them the same number of points as Mendon. As Trenton. The rest of the analyses were pretty straightforward. Most of them were widening projects, where we're going from, you know, narrow lanes, narrow unstriped lanes with no shoulders to, you know, more standard cross sections that are accepted by your towns and cities. And so they were just based on the AEDT that was given, the configuration of, or the change in the cross section. If you were going from a 2-lane undivided highway and you were just widening, then you were given credit for widening. If you went from a 2-lane intersection to a 2 lanes with a two-way left turn lane in the center, then I would model that as a change in cross section and give you, you know, the credit for the reduction in crashes based on the change in those cross sections. Other than that, I think most of them are pretty straightforward. I'd like to give anyone an opportunity if they'd like to ask a question about their application, and I could give them feedback on how I saw it, the modeling and the changes that were being made.
I don't have a question about my application, but I did kind of question the idea that a new road creates an inherently unsafer condition. Seems odd, and maybe it does in some respects. Typically in the roads that I'm dealing with, we would do a new road to help alleviate a level of service condition where we're over capacity on our roadways. We're creating new roadways to reduce that capacity and therefore enhance safety, security, those types of measures for all, not just vehicles, but for pedestrians and bicyclists and that level. So it just struck me as odd when you said that there's no points for new roads or something. I think there may be some conditions where that could be viable.
I mean, there's lots of ways to look at this. For example, when you're rerouting traffic, or you're making, you know, you're reducing congestion because you're providing an alternative route, you could go back and you could calculate the safety of all the surrounding network and then calculate what the relief would be if you added that link in.
Please know we don't have enough money to do that.
Time or money.
Those kind of analysis are
Complex.
really.
Yeah.
That was kind of my comment. I was on the same page as Darren here. When you're reducing the number of right-hand turn and left-hand turn, the conflicts that are inherent to those turn movements in the surrounding areas, I think there's value to that. And in the case of,
But do you understand how squishy that is?
it sure is. But
It is.
Now, that being said, let's talk about the intersection separately, okay? That being said, when you look at a roadway and you look at the publication, the Highway Safety Manual, the crash frequency always increases with volume. Okay, so what that's telling you is that if you keep a roadway section and you don't change it, it's just constant, right? That means the more volume you have on it, the more crashes you're going to have on it. So I think there is a claim here where you're like, yeah, a new roadway segment could reduce crashes. But in the ultimate scheme of things, that would require an overall network analysis. Okay. And chances are the way the multipliers work for the length of roadway you're putting in, and the length increases linear, whereas the crashes are not necessarily linear. And so what happens is, my experience is you don't gain a lot. Okay, so you need to keep in mind, we build roadways for different purposes. We build roadways for access and congestion, addressing congestion issues, and we also add elements to our roadway to make them safer, right? And so there's kind of this trade-off as to what we're really building that roadway segment for, right? We have to keep all that in mind, and I think you guys understand that. I'm kind of preaching to the choir. Now, intersections, you're right. Intersections are far more sensitive to crashes than segments are because of their conflicts. Again, you're looking at, okay, so are we splitting so many hairs here to try to, inherently gain this? If I have this many left turns here, and I can reduce that by putting a link segment over there that puts in, that transfers those left turns to right turns and everything else, yes, you can, from a network analysis, you can reduce crashes, but it's not as straightforward as I think you might think. It's not as linear as most engineers look at it. And so in the interest of budget, in the interest of time, we just made a decision for new roadway segments. I have no way to compare what the before effect is, and therefore I'm not going to calculate an after effect, because then I'm just going to dig myself a hole.
You're right, Darren, but for us, there's just a practical reality of how do we have, if you really think about that network analysis and trying to, first of all, there's just a question of how much traffic's going to be offset from those potentially less safe corridors so that's in and of itself a big kind of challenge and costly endeavor, and then trying to figure out what that means. So unless we figure out some other way to do this, it just is not really practical for this process.
It just caught me off guard, that topic, and I think this process, you actually capture some of those needs and some of the other assessments that we do. The congestion, for example, would look at that heavily.
Well, and we tried to give Dallas the professional latitude, and that's why in our application, when we asked you a question of, what are the safety aspects of this project, you can make a pitch and say, look, this proximity of this project to this road, which is horribly unsafe, is such that it's going to attract some of that traffic.
And reference the study that you've already done at that type.
And then he can make, because he has discretion, the latitude to make that call and maybe give you extra points because of that, without having to do a full-blown analysis. So
that makes sense.
That option still be, he's got to know that, because otherwise, it's hard to assume that the whole network is unsafe and everything that's going to go on this road is going to be safe.
Makes sense.
And typically, we always anticipate that any new road is built to the highest safety standard, most current safety. So our assumption is that it's a safer road. But yeah, just the fact that you're adding new volume on a road that doesn't exist exposes more crashes.
Full disclosure, we are not building a new road in Logan, just so you know.
It's a good point. We struggle with that.
Yeah.
Because these things aren't as straight, and anytime you try to put it, our old system was even worse. Because, trying to put it through a rigid, it just becomes hard. We even have that challenge on the congestion thing, because, you can say, for a new road, what do you use for the congestion? If we have a model, we can use some model numbers to anticipate that. But absent that, do you look at the congestion level on all the adjacent corridors and use that? It gets really squishy. And we struggle with squishy. You want to know why we struggle with squishy? because all you guys are highly intelligent and you are all motivated to watch for things, to challenge that are squishy, and we hear from it. And so we have to try to build a system where we have as least amount of that as we can. Does that make sense?
Appreciate it.
Yes. You're squishy.
There's just a lot of squish going on here.
Anything else, Dallas?
Not unless anyone has any questions.
Dallas, did you give any safety points for, say, fold outs or center medians that have safe areas of refuge, or is that just the 1 point for vulnerable users?
So that's a good question. That would probably fall into the 1 point. And the reason I say that is because in the highway safety manual, it's all based on vehicular crashes, and then they back calculate a proportion of your vehicle crashes as pedestrians and bicyclists. And that's only in the urban environment. In the rural environment, they don't consider pedestrians and bicyclists. But in the urban environment, they say, well, on average, this type of road has, 2% of their crashes are pedestrians or bicyclists. Okay, and so that very small number then gets multiplied by what's called a crash modification factor for a pedestrian refuge, right? So in some of my notes, I say things like a CMF for separated bike lanes, a CMF for like a new sidewalk was applied to the model. The problem is those CMFs are applied to such small numbers that the rounding becomes so ridiculously small that you really don't see much credit for it, right? You'll notice that on my final table, I think I went out to 4 decimal places in one incident, or 3, where you're really getting out there into the area where you're like, what's really going on here, right? And so in those cases, I try to give them credit for that, but ultimately it would just be that 1 point is what I'm adding. And that was just as a gesture of let's try to help people that are trying to do this. What we could go back and do is we could reanalyze, and I'm not proposing we do that this year, but you could consider it, is we could go back and we could say, okay, well, yeah, there's only 2% of the crashes, but those crashes are what we calculated to be, 6.8 or whatever it was, or was it 8.6? 6.8 times more likely. And so you could start playing a numbers game to try to get those to get a greater credit for them. But for this year, I just thought, just because people are trying to do it and they're spending money on it, we ought to give them something. And so I decided to give them a point. I don't know, that was a really long answer for not much, but
Thank
I don't
you.
know if that
Dallas,
answered.
I appreciate your explaining and clarifying and walking through this. That's very helpful. Just looking at the scoring and what you just said about, the actual value or benefit for some of those things, like Tom just asked, is that inherent in the 1 point or whatever? In my mind, it seems to me that a lot of these projects, safety points is up to 15 points, but in order to actually really get a reasonable amount of that 15 points for most projects, it's just going to be cost prohibitive to actually include the safety components in there to get something that's going to work to actually make an impact on getting points in the selection process for safety. Unless it's like the Logan and Nibley project where, those improvements are already part of those corridors. It's all inherent with those overall projects and other phases and things like that. But you're just not going to put in things in there for safety improvements because it's just going to triple the cost of the project to get 3 extra points. I'm just throwing numbers out. I don't know that.
Yeah.
Is that a correct assessment, or do you see other options with that?
So the challenge that the state has, not just Cache County, but Utah and a lot of the western states is that our pedestrian crashes are increasing just like the rest of the nation. Our vehicle crashes are generally going down, but our pedestrian crashes are going up every year. And so that's raised a lot of flags for a lot of people to say, hey, we need to do something here. But it's particularly difficult in the West because we have so much urban sprawl that we get these pedestrian crashes are scattered over a wider area. And in order to put in, make the investment to put in sidewalk and to put in bike lanes and to put in everything else, it becomes very difficult to try to justify it on a systemic method, right? To say we're going to put bicycle lanes everywhere, and we're going to do all these improvements. And so what really needs to happen in my mind, and this is just my opinion, I'm espousing here or whatever, is there needs to be a plan. Like the county, the cities, they all need to have a plan of saying, where do our pedestrians go? Where do we want to have access for our pedestrians and our bicyclists? Where are those center hubs of interest that people are going to be walking and doing and exercising? And, and we're going to provide facilities in those areas to promote that. But to try to do it everywhere, I think is going to be very difficult from a cost standpoint and trying to balance the benefits with the costs, unless you decide to do something more on an ethical basis or a political basis where you're like, it's the right thing to do, we're going to do it. They're all users, we're going to spend our money, we're going to do it, right? So that's kind of my soapbox and my opinion on things here. We definitely could rethink how we give points to pedestrians and bicyclists and come up with a higher ranking or a higher scoring method for those. But I think, I think with the low volumes that we're looking at, it's going to be hard to justify them at each location. The reason, by the way, the reason that Logan and Nibley scored so highly was because of the intersection. Whenever you tangle with an intersection, especially one that's got some traffic at it, that's where a concentration of crashes happen. And so very simple changes at intersections can yield very large dividends. Nibley's big benefit was because they put in a roundabout. Roundabouts, they reduce crashes by 80% and they reduce fatal and serious injury crashes by even more, right? So they tend to have a huge bang when you install them in. Logan was interesting because they're currently operating as a four-way all-way stop control. And up until, like I said, last year, there was no models for all-way stop controls. And so, we didn't really have much to compare with. I used the new model that they published last year to analyze this, and I was surprised to see that there would be actually a change in crashes going from an all-way stop control to a signal. But that's got some nuances in it. Okay, I'm using a calibration factor of 1 for Cache County because I don't have a calibration for Cache County. But statewide, looking at state routes, signalized intersections have a calibration factor of 2.5 in Utah, right? So the fact that I inherently used a CMF of 1, or excuse me, a calibration factor of 1 for Cache County may not be too representative. I may have wanted to use something that was more typical of the state routes. Now, the state routes carry a lot of vehicles. They have a lot more crashes, and they operate them in a way that's focused on movement, through movement. And because of that, their calibration factor is high. Now, I could start implementing those calibration factors at Cache County. I just didn't feel comfortable with that because I'm not comfortable enough with Cache County to know really how you guys operate your signals, independent of the state.
Just have maybe 2 questions. I know with Safe Routes to School, their UDOT side, they look at a sidewalk, and if it's one side of the street, they don't really look at the other side of the street. is that the case here? Do we look at one side, if there's already sidewalk on one side, is there much benefit scoring wise on having a sidewalk on the other side? So that's one question. So anyway, I'm just kind of curious at scoring if you were on the UDOT thinking there that, hey, as long as they have sidewalk on one side, then anyway, I just kind of curious.
Yeah. I actually saw a presentation out of Australia last week that pointed out that, you know, for bicyclists, it's more important to get both bicyclists on what they call a bicycle track, which is separated from the roadway on one side of the roadway, because then you use less right of way, right? Rather than trying to put a bicycle lane on both sides of the road, right? And I think that kind of goes the same thing with pedestrians, but you got to be careful about your neighborhood, right? If nobody lives on the right hand side of the road and all your houses are on the left hand side of the road, then putting sidewalk on the right hand side of the road only makes sense if you don't want the new home developers to put in their own sidewalk, right? It's kind of, what is the plan that the city wants? You know, if you have a neighborhood and they only have sidewalk on one side of the road, that means that you're going to expect people to cross the road to get to the sidewalk or walk in the road.
So in your scoring, did you, I mean, I'll just pick on my project, not that you have to change anything. That's not what I'm asking for. I'm just trying to understand the UDOT side, but mine's Providence. And so I have a sidewalk on the north side. The project puts a sidewalk on the south side, or you know, that's kind of the design if everything works out. So do I get points to do a sidewalk on the south, or because there's already one on the north? Because like I go back to UDOT and Safe Routes to School, they talk about, oh, well, if you have it on one side, we're not gonna give you any points or towards a grant on the other side. So I was just kind of curious, in your scoring, not that you have to pick on my project, but on your scoring, is that included? Am I benefited in safety scoring from you if I add sidewalks on both sides? Do I get points if I add it on one side but not the other? I'm just kind of curious. I'm just trying to pick inside your brain, not necessarily what others doing. Just kind of picking. Just curious.
So I would, you know, I didn't have any applications that I can think of that met in that category. But what I looked at is, okay, so if there's sidewalk already on the roadway and there's pedestrians on the roadway and they're widening it and they're not going to provide anything on the other road, on the other side, then I just analyzed it and I didn't look at any VRU. If they're going to add sidewalk on the right hand side, what kind of sidewalk are they adding, right? If they're going to add sidewalk, yeah, I might throw them a point. Now keep in mind, I said 1 point, right? I didn't say points. And that was arbitrarily set, right? And that could be discussed. If you know, if you guys get direction as technical advisory committee and decide you want to push it in a different direction, then I can adjust that. But for right now, you know, I only looked at things if the project application and the drawings pointed out that they were enhancing something for the pedestrians, right? So for example, in North Logan is not only widening the road, but they're doing a separated trail that's both for pedestrians and bicyclists. Now, it's only on one side of the road. But when I read that flags in my mind, okay, it's a trail. We're taking pedestrians and bicyclists, we're taking them off of the roadway, and what's more is we've got a buffer space in between. So in my mind, that rose a flag, I gave them an extra point.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you have two questions.
I know what that was now. I had a second one.
In case another one came up.
If I talk in circles long enough, right, then everyone gives up anyway. So that was
any other questions to Dallas?
Sorry.
Okay, so we're back to this overall ranking. Again, your role is, I mean, individually, you may not necessarily, your project may not have gotten as many points as you'd like, nonetheless, really the lens we're asking you to look through is has this process, your oversight role for staff has this process, the CTAC scoring, and the criteria that's been set by the elected officials, has it been fairly applied? Has it addressed, adequately captured the aspects of the project that are needed to assign the scores? And are you comfortable approving this scoring recommendation to the full cost? That's what's really reported.
Motion on that?
We would like a motion on that. And technically, each city, unless there's dissent and opposing votes, it doesn't really matter. But technically, each city has a vote on this if there's controversy.
I'll make the motion that we proceed with the scoring as it is.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Darren, so motion was from Ryan Snow. Second was from Darren Farr. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, so we will advance this to next Monday's presentation meeting. On this mayor's score sheet, they will see the CTAC scores, and then they'll add theirs to it. They still have to accept your CTAC scores, and ultimately they have to approve that to the county council. So I guess if they had some concern.
We'll see you all again after that.
We're gonna have to circle back to you. But generally, they've tasked you with that role, and I don't anticipate, unless there was some big issue or concern of fairness, that one of them would want to raise. But technically, we're just a recommending body, that in our policies, our job is to formally recommend and oversee that story. So we will do so on Monday and bring that. And then ultimately, those scores, after they rank theirs, are what ultimately gets approved by the full COG. Dallas, you can bug out if you want at this point.
Okay.
Dallas, would you be able to join the October, did we talk about that? October 2nd meeting? It might be good if you, 5 PM, October 2nd, if you could be on virtually for the first part of the call, in case some safety question comes up by the elected officials. Is that doable?
Yeah, that's fine. 5 o'clock on the 5th of October.
Second,
The 2nd, sorry.
Monday night.
Oh, Monday night. Okay, yeah, that's fine. If you'll just send me a link to the meeting and invite,
will.
I'll show up and.
So that particular item should be right at the beginning of the meeting.
Okay.
And so you could just stay on for that and then bug out if needed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good luck, guys. Let me know if I can help in any other way, or if you want to make some adjustments later on, that'd be great too.
Okay, we might have a discussion offline for next year of on vulnerable users, kind of your emphasis, whether we would want to weight that heavier or not. Heavier or not.
Okay.
We'll kind of do that offline, getting ready maybe for next year. Take this.
Good luck. Thank you.
All right, Jesse.
Okay, we also have before you compiled the technical review that this body is kind of tasked with, is going through and looking at the plans and maybe raising technical issues or concerns that are seen. This went out to all the jurisdictions that had applications, and the members of this body to provide comment. So again, you can see kind of the overview of the projects, what they are, and then the questions that were addressed or raised from this group, the applicant's response, and then some notes from COG staff as well. So again, this isn't maybe something that we're not necessarily seeking approval or anything like that, but we just wanted to make sure this body had the opportunity to see it. And if there are any questions that we need to address, we can, or if there's something we misunderstood, something we want to set clarity, but this will go out in the agenda this afternoon to all the mayors for their review and to be able to reference as they rank and vote on the project, so.
The executive committee at least did like this concept as a way to gather, well, first of all, facilitate deeper technical analysis and reviews, and also a way to kind of capture those and provide information to them. So this exact way is kind of new this year. In our policies, it just calls for the technical committee to provide a briefing and technical review. It doesn't really tell us how we do it. And I guess at this point, from the perspective of Todd staff and the executive committee, we're pretty pleased with the way to do this. It's helped identify some issues that we wouldn't have caught, or if staff does some of these reviews, but it's better to have more eyes on it, people looking from different perspectives. So I guess unless you oppose, I mean, I think we'll try to implement something like this every year moving forward as a way to provide that technical review.
Coordination back and forth works well, so thank you.
There is a hunger on the part of the elected officials to kind of, they feel incapable of some of these technical issues, even though they know they're there, and so they've wanted something like this to know that some of these things have been looked at, and hence the clarifier, resolve them were there. So I think that kind of helps. We often hear from them of, they feel not really capable of making some of these decisions and some of these technical issues. So I think this will empower them a little bit to feel more comfortable about making some decisions. Any concerns? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I said there's no concerns, again, and if you think we've misunderstood something, then we're willing to have a little bit of discussion, but again, this isn't seeking approval or anything, but if you have questions, you can either bring them now or you can put them on after the meeting, otherwise, if there's nothing else, I think we're ready to adjourn.
I think you should add to the process and know that what happens is you fill out and then there's a response. I just, sometimes when that response comes, it adds another question, I guess.
Yeah, and we jumped
So,
up about,
if there is one other.
are you trying to do one more round of that next year?
To just say, okay, now we're looking at it now, that is 75, because now some of the answers have certainly questions for that.
Yeah, and we talked about that a little bit this morning when we were looking at this, is how many times do you do that without it still be effective, but
The other thing though, to keep in mind is, there's nothing stopping a jurisdiction if they feel they need to add clarification to what's in here, or if it was painted in a way they don't agree with, you could address that in the presentation straight up. The other thing you could do is, it doesn't stop a mayor from asking an unresolved question about another project when that presentation comes up as well. So it's not the final word necessarily on it, and you could work with your elected officials if there's some clarification that you don't have satisfaction on, that you think ought to be escalated. There's still that opportunity, but maybe next year, we struggled a bit just because we try to give a lot of time for you to do your applications, but then that kind of shrinks down once we get to processing these. So we've kind of I mean, and it seems to get worse every year for
It's-
Jesse.
It's a very tight window when you're looking at 6 weeks from the time applications are due to the time you go to the full call for approval. And then that puts us in the council at the end of October, because the council gets harder as the closer to the end of the year, there's more budget issues, there's more, it make it harder to get the councils.
Do you have other things to do too, Jesse?
I do, and this is occupied the last 2 weeks of my to-do list is very long, but
There's, because in between there's a lot of benchmarks to hit. We have to meet with the executive committee, do the eligibility review.
we've got a couple
Dallas
of
has to do his thing. We have to do our, I mean, there's just kind of a lot of steps within there. So if we did something, we'd have to kind of rethink our schedule to allow the CTAC part to have a circle back. But, you know, I think maybe one circle back might be appropriate. I think beyond that, though, it becomes
Oh, yeah, that's
kind of like, it should go on forever.
I forgot, is the executive committee, they then make them copy, they do a recommendation on the committee?
So the executive committee of the COG is the chair, vice chair, and then the county executive, because it's a county. Distributed account is always on that, so their main role, other than obviously, you know, meeting and agendas, approvals and all that. But their main role is to kind of weigh in on the available funding that we're gonna make available, amount. And then also, kind of eligibility review of applications, completeness review. So we met with them when all the applications came in, kind of went over, you know, what's missing. They get to weigh in on, you know, is the magnitude of missing information such that the application should be thrown out, those sort of things. And that's their primary role. They don't, and then the other thing they do is, you know, if there's any interpretation issues of COG policy, or if someone says, you know, you're not doing this right, we can bounce it off of them. But beyond that, they don't approve a recommendation to the county or to the full COG. They just oversee the process. And we try to brief them on what steps we're taking and that kind of thing. They will, and I think you'll see this as we talk about policy revisions for 2024, you know, they might propose a policy change that they talked about in their oversight role. But beyond that, does that answer your question?
You remind me what the role says, I think there's 7 million available, but what's the role says?
that'll be in the pod. I was gonna run these numbers before, but
It's about 13%, right?
yeah, so. Yeah, because there's just over 7 million, so you're somewhere in the, I think just about $900,000 range.
Which would all go to Richmond.
So we'll have those I was gonna run those numbers and kind of have them finalized, because we'll discuss that at the beginning. That's on the agenda for Monday night's meeting, is that final. Because the typical thing is when we send out the call for applications with base what the actual tax revenue money is up till about that April point, and we try to make an estimated of what that is for every month out the rest of the year. And then we true those numbers up in October based on what those actual values were from April through September. So that way it usually goes up a couple $100,000. And then I guess for anyone here that does have a project, always send out an email this afternoon as well. That we're looking at about 5 minutes for your presentation and then a few minutes following that for questions. So please be prepared for that. And if you can get those to us sometime on Monday, then we'll get them all downloaded on the computer and queued up, so that way we're not gonna deal with USBs and things like that while we're in that meeting, so.
So is this the order presentation as well then, or will that change?
Sure. We can go down the list.
Great.
Yeah, I think
That numbering's random, but that's, yeah, we can go down.
we've typically done it that way for lack of a better way to do it.
You didn't want to go in reverse order of this? We almost last.
That way he gets to be done. The second one, he doesn't have to stress the rest of the meeting on. Being reversed percent, so.
So you can kind of help us with technical issues. I mean, it'd be good if you could get your PowerPoint to us, like you said, a little early, so I guess I just caution you, if you bring it on thumb drive, we'll certainly try to accommodate it, and it should work fine. But if there's some technical glitch, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's on your risk. You calculate the risk, but if you send us a PowerPoint, we can open it and kind of say, yeah, we're good. But thumb drive, sometimes things go ski-wampus, so try not to do that. Thanks, everyone. I think
Okay.
that's it.
Yeah, if you want more pizza, feel free to grab some on your way out. Thank you for making the time to come today, so.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt.
You guys.
Thanks for making it.